Rockville, Maryland, 1969. A peaceful suburb just outside Washington, D.C., where sidewalks were clean, neighbors smiled at each other, and families believed they were safe from the world's chaos. The Clark family lived on one of those quiet streets, in a modest brick home that looked like any other. Behind those walls were 5 lives that, on the surface, seemed ordinary. The mother, Ruth Clark, was known as a disciplined and hardworking woman. She carried the weight of raising 4 children on her own shoulders and made sure they never lacked the essentials. Her home was tidy, her rules firm, and her expectations clear. She believed in doing what was right, even when her children didn't always agree. Patricia and Carol, the 2 older daughters, helped their mother keep the house in order. They shared chores, helped with cooking, and looked after their little brother James, who was only 10 years old. James was cheerful, loved playing in the yard, and adored his older siblings. The family had its struggles like any other, but they were a picture of suburban life in the late 60s. Then there was Kenneth William Clark, 15 years old, quiet, withdrawn. He kept mostly to himself and didn't have many close friends at school. Teachers described him as polite but distant. He did his work but rarely spoke unless spoken to. At home, Kenneth's silence was often mistaken for calm, but those who paid attention saw something else: a restlessness, a kind of growing frustration that had no outlet. Ruth's firm approach to parenting often clashed with Kenneth's teenage rebellion. Arguments about school, friends, and responsibility became frequent. What seemed like normal tension between a mother and her teenage son began to grow into something darker. Kenneth's anger simmered quietly. He felt misunderstood, confined, and alone. Neighbors occasionally overheard raised voices from inside the Clark home, but no one thought much of it. In those days, family issues stayed inside the family. People believed that discipline and time would fix anything. Rockville was not the kind of town where people expected tragedy. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and trusted that nothing truly bad could happen there. Beneath that image of calm, however, something inside Kenneth was breaking. He spent more time alone, often wandering the neighborhood or locking himself in his room. Friends later said he had started to change, moodier, colder, unpredictable. No one reached out, and Kenneth didn't ask for help. The gap between him and his family widened with each passing day. By March of 1969, tension in the Clark home was constant. The smallest argument could ignite into shouting. Ruth's patience was wearing thin, and Kenneth's resentment was reaching a point of no return. On the morning of March 19th, the family woke up to what seemed like an ordinary day. Ruth prepared breakfast. Patricia helped her younger siblings get ready. Kenneth sat quietly and eating in silence, his mind far away. No one noticed that he was unusually withdrawn. No one imagined that this day would be their last together. For Rockville, it was just another calm Wednesday. The streets were peaceful, children played outside, and families prepared for another evening in safety. But inside the Clark home, something irreversible was about to happen. The tension that had been building for months was about to erupt in a way no one could have predicted. By the time the sun set that day, the peace of Rockville would be gone. The Clark family's home, once filled with ordinary sounds of life, would become the scene of one of Maryland's most haunting tragedies. A tragedy born not of strangers or outside forces, but from within a son, a brother, and the silence no one dared to question. It started like any other morning in the Clark household. The clock ticked steadily, the sun rose over Rockville, and the world moved on as if nothing was wrong. But inside that modest brick house, pressure had been building for weeks. Ruth Clark's voice had grown sharper, and Kenneth's patience thinner. Every small disagreement now carried the weight of something much larger. Kenneth had become more distant in the months leading up to that day. Teachers noticed the change first. His grades had dropped, and he had stopped interacting with other students. He walked through the halls alone, his head down, speaking only when necessary. Some thought he was simply shy. Others sensed something was wrong, but couldn't name what it was. At home, his siblings tried to include him, but he often brushed them off. Patricia once told a friend that Kenneth didn't like talking anymore. The Clark home was a strict one. Ruth believed that discipline was the backbone of success, and she ruled her household accordingly. Kenneth often felt like he could never meet her expectations. If he failed a test, it was a lecture. If he came home late, it was punishment. There was love there, but it was buried under tension, pride, and the pressure to be perfect. Kenneth's frustration turned inward. Instead of lashing out, he withdrew into silence, allowing resentment to grow unchecked. The arguments between mother and son became more frequent. Neighbors recalled hearing raised voices late at night. One even remembered Kenneth storming out of the house barefoot in the middle of winter after an argument, walking down the street until he disappeared into the dark. But by the next morning, he would always return. The cycle repeated itself: argument, anger, silence, apology, and then another argument. As March 1969 arrived, Ruth grew increasingly worried about her son's behavior. She reportedly considered sending him to counseling or a correctional program. For Kenneth, this idea was unbearable. To him, it was one more sign that his mother didn't understand him. One more reason to believe she saw him as a problem rather than a son. In the days leading up to the murders, Kenneth had isolated himself almost completely. He skipped meals, avoided eye contact, and spent hours in his room. Family members thought he was simply being moody. In reality, he was quietly planning to end the turmoil in the only way his fractured mind could imagine. That morning, the argument began over something small, perhaps chores, schoolwork, or a missed responsibility. No one alive can say exactly what words were exchanged, but what's known is that Kenneth's anger erupted in a way it never had before. What started as a heated exchange spiraled into shouting, and then into something far more dangerous. The weapon that would soon end 4 lives was already inside the home, a .22 caliber rifle his mother kept for protection. Kenneth knew where it was. He had seen her use it to scare off stray animals near the property. To Ruth, it was a household precaution. To Kenneth, it became a symbol of final power. In that moment, something inside him broke. Years of frustration, anger, and isolation collided. The quiet boy who never fought back was gone, replaced by a wave of uncontrollable emotion. There was no logic left, no restraint, only a burning desire to make everything stop. No one will ever know exactly what thoughts ran through Kenneth's mind as he took hold of that rifle. But by then, the line between right and wrong had blurred beyond recognition. The boy who once wanted peace had surrendered completely to rage. The breaking point had come. The balance between discipline and defiance, between control and collapse, was gone. And in the small, peaceful suburb of Rockville, the Clark home, once filled with ordinary family noise, was about to descend into silence. March 19, 1969. The day that began like any other was ending in tragedy that no one could have imagined. Evening settled over Rockville, the streets quiet, the air still. Inside the Clark home, tension reached its final limit. What happened next would leave the entire community in disbelief. Kenneth had argued with his mother earlier that day. What was said between them is lost to time, but investigators believe it was the spark that ignited everything. Ruth, exhausted from constant conflict, had scolded her son again, perhaps about school or his attitude. Kenneth said little in response. He walked away silent, retreating into his room. No one knew that the silence wasn't calm. It was building into something deadly. At some point that afternoon, Kenneth went to the place where his mother kept the rifle. It was a simple .22 caliber, small but powerful enough to take a life. He had handled it before, knew how it worked, knew what it could do. In that moment, something inside him shifted. Logic, fear, reason all gone. What remained was the belief that if he acted now, everything would finally be over. Ruth was in another room, unaware of what was coming. She had likely believed the argument had passed, as so many before it had. But this time there would be no apology, no reconciliation, no second chance. When Kenneth appeared in the doorway, rifle in hand, the home that had seen so many ordinary days became a scene of horror. The first shot ended the argument forever. What followed was confusion, chaos, and silence. Kenneth's siblings, hearing the noise, came running. In that split second, the house turned into a nightmare. Within moments, 4 lives were lost: a mother, 2 daughters, and a young son. The details of how each one fell were later reconstructed by investigators, but the truth remained the same. Kenneth had destroyed his entire family. Neighbors would later tell police they heard what they thought were firecrackers. In Rockville, gunfire wasn't common, and no one thought to check. The house remained still for hours, lights glowing through the windows, an eerie calm masking the devastation inside. Kenneth didn't run immediately. He stayed in the house for a short while, though no one knows what he did or what he thought. Perhaps he was in shock. Perhaps he couldn't comprehend what he had done. When the reality of it began to sink in, he left, walking away from the home and into the darkness of Rockville's quiet streets. It didn't take long before someone noticed something was wrong. A neighbor, concerned that the house was unusually quiet and the blinds hadn't moved, decided to check. When police arrived, they found the front door unlocked. What they saw inside would haunt them for years. The home was silent, still, and heavy with the smell of gunpowder. In the living room and bedrooms lay the remains of the Clark family. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a break-in, and no missing valuables. The conclusion was immediate and devastating. Someone inside the home had done it. Kenneth was nowhere to be found. The manhunt began within the hour. Police searched nearby woods, parks, and roads, spreading word across Montgomery County. A teenager with dark hair, walking alone, carrying a rifle. Within a few hours, an officer spotted him on a rural road several miles from home. Kenneth didn't resist. When questioned, he said very little. He was calm, distant, almost emotionless. To the officer, it was as if the boy didn't fully grasp the weight of his actions. By the time he was taken into custody, the story was already spreading across Maryland. A quiet 15-year-old had murdered his entire family. In a town where violence was rare, the Clark name became synonymous with tragedy. The quiet suburban home that once symbolized safety now stood as a reminder that even in the most peaceful places, darkness can hide in plain sight. The murders of the Clark family shocked not just Rockville, but the entire state. It was senseless, incomprehensible, and deeply haunting. And for Kenneth William Clark, the boy who had taken everything from himself, the long shadow of what he had done was only beginning. At the police station, the silence was unbearable. Kenneth William Clark sat in the small interrogation room, his hands cuffed, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't cry, didn't shake, didn't speak. For hours, detectives tried to reach him, asking what happened, why he did it, how he could turn a weapon on his own family. Each question met the same quiet stare. It was as if the boy they were questioning wasn't fully present, as if part of him had already drifted somewhere far beyond reach. When he finally spoke, his words were slow, cold, and unsettling. He admitted to shooting his mother first. Then, when his siblings came running, he said he had to finish it. The officers in the room exchanged glances, not of triumph, but disbelief. This was no hardened criminal. This was a 15-year-old boy. No drugs, no gang ties, no known history of violence. Just a quiet, reserved teenager who, for reasons still unclear, had erased his family from existence. The confession was recorded. Kenneth never denied his guilt. He gave no elaborate story, no excuse. When asked if he regretted it, he simply said, "It doesn't matter now." That phrase, emotionless and final, became one of the most chilling statements in the case file. To detectives, it revealed something deeper, a mind detached from the enormity of its actions. Psychiatrists were quickly brought in to examine him. What they found only deepened the mystery. Kenneth was intelligent, articulate, and fully aware of right and wrong. Yet his emotional responses were flat, mechanical, absent of remorse. One report described him as disturbingly calm. Another called him emotionally disconnected from reality. There were no signs of abuse, no traumatic events in his past, no clear motive. Some experts speculated that years of suppressed anger toward his mother might have erupted all at once. Others believed it was a case of undiagnosed psychosis. But no one could explain why that particular night, that particular moment, turned deadly. The trial began months later, drawing reporters from across the state. Every newspaper headline carried his name: Boy of 15 slays family. Rockville youth faces murder charge. Silent killer baffles experts. The courtroom was packed every day. People came not only for justice, but for answers. They wanted to understand how a child could commit such horror. But the more Kenneth spoke, the fewer answers they found. Throughout the proceedings, he remained expressionless. He listened as witnesses described the crime scene, as officers recounted his confession, as psychiatrists debated his state of mind. Yet he showed no emotion. When the photographs of the victims were displayed, he didn't look away. When the prosecutor read aloud the charges, 4 counts of first-degree murder, he simply nodded. His defense team argued insanity. They claimed Kenneth's mind had fractured, that he was incapable of understanding what he was doing. The prosecution disagreed, pointing to his methodical actions, his awareness of consequence, and his own calm confession. In the end, the jury had little choice but to convict him. Because of his age, Kenneth was not eligible for the death penalty. The judge sentenced him to life in prison. As the sentence was read, Kenneth stood quietly, his face blank. There were no tears, no pleas, no emotion, just the same eerie calm that had followed him since the night of the murders. Outside the courthouse, the community of Rockville struggled to recover. Reporters swarmed the town, interviewing neighbors, teachers, and classmates. Everyone had the same story. Kenneth was quiet, polite, and never in trouble. No one saw this coming. It was a tragedy that made no sense, a nightmare that had no explanation. In the years that followed, the Clark home was eventually sold. New families moved in, trying to forget the dark history that lingered within its walls. But locals never truly forgot. The story of the boy who killed his family became one of Maryland's most haunting tales, whispered in classrooms, retold in hushed tones, and remembered as the day innocence in Rockville was lost forever. Inside his prison cell, Kenneth Clark remained mostly silent, rarely speaking to other inmates or guards. His file described him as compliant but withdrawn. Decades later, those who remembered the case would still wonder what went wrong, what broke inside that boy to unleash such horror. And though justice was served, one question lingered like a shadow over Rockville. Was Kenneth William Clark truly evil? Or was he a boy lost to something even darker than anyone could see? Years passed, but the memory of the Clark family murders never truly faded from Rockville. Time moved on, the house changed owners, and the headlines disappeared from the front page. Yet the story lingered like an open wound that never fully healed. For those who lived through that era, it wasn't just a tragedy. It was a reminder that evil doesn't always come from strangers in the night. Sometimes it grows quietly, behind familiar walls, in the hearts of those you trust most. In the decades that followed, journalists and criminologists would revisit the case, hoping to make sense of it. The Clark family murders, as it became known, was studied in university courses on juvenile crime, cited in discussions about family dynamics and mental health, and used by psychologists to illustrate the dangers of untreated emotional isolation. Kenneth Clark's case challenged everything people thought they knew about domestic violence because there were no clear warning signs, no history of abuse, no drugs, no outside influence. Just a young man who one night crossed an unthinkable line. Prison reports over the years showed little change in Kenneth's demeanor. He rarely spoke to others and spent most of his time reading or writing letters that were never sent. Guards described him as quiet, intelligent, and polite but detached. One former warden once said, "He looked like a man haunted by something only he could see." Kenneth never sought parole, even when eligible. When asked why, he reportedly replied, "There's nowhere left for me to go." By the late 1980s, the Clark case had become a ghost story of sorts, one passed down through generations of Rockville residents. Parents told their children not to dwell on it, yet the legend persisted. People swore the old Clark home carried a strange presence. Some said lights would flicker late at night, or that faint voices could be heard from the upper floor. Of course, these were only stories, ways for a community to process what it couldn't fully understand. For criminologists, Kenneth's crime became a case study in the psychology of suppressed rage. They saw a boy raised in a rigid home where emotion was seen as weakness, a boy who, rather than rebelling outwardly, turned his pain inward until it consumed him. Modern analysts might call it emotional implosion, a collapse of identity brought on by years of pressure and isolation. Others believe Kenneth's actions were evidence of an undiagnosed mental illness, perhaps schizophrenia, or a rare form of psychopathy that manifested in adolescence. But even with modern science, there was never a definitive answer. The last known update on Kenneth came in the early 2000s. Prison documents indicated he remained a model inmate, still quiet, still distant, still refusing interviews. Whether he felt remorse, no one could say. Some speculated he had long made peace with what he'd done. Others believed he never fully grasped it. And so the silence continued, a silence as chilling as the night he pulled the trigger. Today, over half a century later, the Clark murders remain one of the most disturbing family homicide cases in Maryland's history. It's not remembered for its brutality alone, but for its mystery, for how little anyone truly knew about what was happening inside that house before it was too late. It's a story that raises questions we still can't answer. What drives someone to destroy the people they love most? Could it have been prevented? Or was this tragedy inevitable from the start? The Untold Trace doesn't seek to sensationalize these stories. It seeks to understand them, to explore the human darkness that hides behind normal faces in ordinary families. Because the Clark murders weren't just about death, they were about silence. The silence of a boy who couldn't speak his pain. The silence of a community that didn't see the warning signs. And the silence that still echoes through the decades that followed. Perhaps that's the real legacy of the Clark family murders, not the crime itself, but what it reveals about us all. How fragile the mind can be, how easily despair can turn inward, and how, even after justice is served, some questions are never answered, some wounds never heal, and some silences never end.